Of interviewing Nancy Ing, who I have held in my highest esteem for some time. For those of you watching as prospective adoptive parents or adoptive parents, Nancy is bringing such value to this legacy series. And so I wanted to start out, Nancy, with you just talking a little bit about the the different ways that you have been impacted and touched the world of foster care and adoption. Kind of do a little introduction of yourself.
Okay. Well, I guess my first introduction to adoption and to foster care was many years ago. I don't know, or maybe 50 years ago at this point, during the Vietnam War. And there were biracial kids in Vietnam who were shown on TV on some show about doing something about these kids who were in some kind of a camp. I can't remember exactly, but my memory, which may or may not be accurate, is of a little boy standing behind a fence. I want to say a barbed wire fence, but I'm not sure that's true, but behind a fence. And he looked like my son Michael, who was then about 2 or 3 years old, who is also biracial. And they said, we don't know what's going to happen to these kids. So my husband Harvin and I applied to see what was possible about adopting one of those kids. Well, of course, by the time you get through the process, which is another thing I learned, and we all now know, you don't just pick up the phone and get a child. But anyway, which is good. At any rate, by the time we got through the process, Vietnam was closed, the war was over, and the kids were still there, but there was no way to adopt those kids at that point. At any rate, so we were offered a little girl from Korea who was, we were told, deaf or nearly deaf and about 6 years old. So we went through that process, and we learned in that process, you learn what you learn when you go through an adoption home study, but you don't really learn, at least we didn't learn much that was very valuable to us, I'll have to say. They learned about us, but we learned very little about adoption. And so she came on the plane with a social worker from Korea. You didn't have to go then. We went and picked her up at the airport. And there were 2 little girls from Korea on that plane. One was crying and the other was just laughing, kind of, bopping down the runway. And I thought, oh, I hope that happy one is my child. And it was, which was, of course, the wrong thing to hope. So anyway, she taught me everything I know about adoption. I mean, I learned some other things, but she really taught me. She taught me about attachment. She taught me about waiting children. She taught me everything. And it was because of her that I became interested in FAIR, which was a very fledgling group of adoptive parents. And so that kind of became our lives, actually.
FAIR
supporting adoption. Yeah.
FAIR stands for what?
Families Adopting in Response. Actually, at the time, it was started by transracial adopters in Santa Clara County in California. And it's at that time, it stood for Families Adopting Interracially. But that was kind of it didn't fit who we were anyway. But so we changed the name to Families Adopting in response to the needs of children, not to the needs of parents.
I've always loved that.
We only had, we had 2 children born to us, and I had a stepson who spent part-time with us. He was about 6, and the children born to us were 2 and 3.
Okay. And she was how old?
She was 6 or about 6, yeah.
And you went on to adopt again and again and again.
We did.
Yeah. How many children ultimately did your family grow to?
13.
Okay.
13. So, and again, it's because she taught us. She taught us about what kids need. We didn't always know how to fill that need, but she taught us everything. I'll have to say, because we had no idea. And frankly, the professionals were of very little help to us. They just said, take her home and love her, which we did, but that didn't stop her from doing the things that kids do, light fires and beat up their siblings and, all those things that we all know about.
Yeah.
So we had to learn. And when you learn, you know that there are children waiting every place.
Yes.
So
Yes.
after that,
How did I'm sorry, go ahehead, Nancy.
no, I said we did ask for a Korean sibling for her. And when we referred a little boy who was 4, which was fine. But then I found out I was pregnant. It was a surprise, but not a shock or not a unhappy surprise. So they wouldn't let us take the little boy. And then afterwards, they offered us a little girl who was only 6 months old. We weren't really interested in a baby, but and who is her only disability is that she's missing one hand, which is no disability to her. I can't say it's not more difficult for her, but it's certainly not a disability. But in Korea, they thought she was a special needs child. So we did. So she came. After that, we never asked for another child, but people asked us, and we thought, oh, okay, we could do that.
Okay. And you talked about how difficult it was, how much you had to learn. How did you eventually learn it, and what allowed you to stay in there with a child with the kinds of needs that your first adoption brought to you?
Well, because we were her parents. And when you are a parent, no matter how you became that parent, you have to figure it out, right?
Huh?
And in some ways, I think the lack of good social work was helpful to us because we had to figure it out ourselves. So we really built FAIR up, not just me, but the people who adopted at that time. We built it up. We did a lot of educational seminars. We brought people in. We talked to each other and we supported each other. And
you did wonderful gatherings. You had fabulous support groups. You produced just a phenomenal newsletter, and you actually created curriculum. What a powerful organization. How did you do all that? I mean, you were all parenting high needs children, and yet you managed to do all the rest of these things that served the larger community.
well, you know what they say, if you want somebody to volunteer, pick somebody who's too busy, right? And we were, all of us who were active, busy with some very interesting children. But it was important to us. And so we did it. And it also brought us together. When you work on something like that, you become more than just a support group, you become a community.
Yeah, yeah. Does FAIR still exist?
FAIR still exists. It's not nearly as active as it was. We still have one active support group meeting. They meet here, of course, but that's fine. It's a different group in terms of not so much in terms of the kids, but in terms of the resources out there. We don't have a newsletter anymore. People don't have newsletters, I guess. And online is more tricky for us as parents to share personal things. So I do miss that. I do miss the newsletter.
Yeah.
But the support group is ongoing. It's just almost everybody in the support group who comes to the meetings. It's not large, maybe 12 to 20 people come. Almost all of them have kids who either are in residential treatment or have been in residential treatment, which, I mean, it never occurred to us. It didn't exist, I guess, or if it did, it wasn't therapeutic. So.
Yeah, wow. Well, you had to learn an awful lot. So, what would some of those key lessons be? I mean, if a family was sitting down with you today and saying, we're thinking about doing this, what do we need to keep in mind? What needs to occur in terms of our individual self-care, our marriage, our other children? You had to have learned and balanced so much. What would some of those lessons be?
Well, I think, I think the hardest lesson was remembering to put our own oxygen on first, really. Because it's, the kids, as you well know, can really overwhelm you. And so you focus on them, and you forget that, wait a minute, I have to breathe. And I have to support my marriage, or whatever, my partnership with someone.
Right.
And that's a hard lesson to learn. But that's why I think it's so important that parents talk to parents before they adopt, not just parents, but that there's resources from real families with real children who are not, sweet little babies. Not that they don't have their own issues, but, real kids with real problems, and their real parents talking to other people who are interested in adoption. And we did do some of those classes, taught some of those classes, and people are shocked at it, but they can't really deny it if it's your story. Or I think that it's easy to deny a social worker or somebody who says that's, oh, well, not me. I mean,
Right.
that could happen to some people, but not me.
Right.
Oh.
Well, I was actually talking to a therapist this morning in another state, and she said to me, the kids come in and they're doing great. We're doing great work together. They're healing, but they go home and the parents aren't willing to change. They aren't willing to look at their own issues. And so the kids can't grow. The kids can't change because the parents haven't changed. It's the same environment, and the parents keep getting angrier. What allowed you and your husband to hang in there? What did you have to change? What did you have to come to terms with?
Well, I think being stubborn is always a good thing for parents. You certainly can learn that from these kids.
Yes.
They never give up. So like, oh, well, I can do that. But also I think it's the idea that there must be a way. There must be something we can do. I'm not sure what it is, but we have to hang in there, one of our kids said, well, you made a lot of mistakes, but at least you didn't give up on me. True. Both of those things are true. We made a lot of mistakes, but we never gave up on them. Yeah. So it's a process of learning. I'm still learning, right? We're all still learning, but it's as I get older, I'm more and more, I've never been a real fan of AA. I think it's a wonderful organization, but it's, as their philosophy for me wouldn't work if I needed it. Just doesn't quite appeal to me. But I'll have to say that the Serenity Prayer is probably the most beautiful prayer ever in existence. And that's part of parenting any child, but certainly parenting these kids. The difficult part is to know that there are things you can't change, to accept those things you can't change, but not give up hope on them.
Yes.
It's a dichotomy, right?
Yes.
But
it is. It's walking a fine line all the time.
Right.
Yeah. And you have a sense of humor. And
absolutely.
I think you can't lose that, can you?
Absolutely you can't. Excuse me just one moment. I just want to get a tissue here. Sorry, it's spring here, lots of allergies.
Oh, I know. That's me too. Box of Kleenex everywhere. Yeah.
Right. People often ask me, as they do you, I'm sure, what does it take to be an adoptive parent, to be successful? And I think it's two things. One is commitment, no matter what. The other is a sense of humor. If you don't have those, you can't do it. You can't do it.
And support. I mean, you've
and support.
Obviously you and your husband worked together.
We did.
You had a partner, and then you had this support group that you could rely on, where I'm sure you did a lot of laughter about the crazy things that were happening at your house.
Oh, absolutely we did. Absolutely. My husband and I laughed about it every night, that when we should have been sleeping or doing, we would laugh about the funny things. And our support group used to meet in an elementary school where my kids went. Had a wonderful principal there. We used to meet in the teacher's lounge and at night. And he used to work late, like principals sometimes do. One time he said to me, Nancy, what do you do in there? And I said, well, you know, we're a support group. And he said, well, all I ever hear is like, seems like you're crying and you're laughing. And I said, that's what we do. That's it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So what were some of the mistakes that you made when your kids pointed out to you? And I'm sure they do. Um,
How much time do we have, Sharon?
what were your top 10 mistakes?
My top 10 mistakes were one that I could somehow mold them. I could influence them a little bit sometimes, but they came. I mean, that's one of the great lessons of adoption, I think. And we say it about our children born to us, but we don't really believe it about them. But with adopted children, you have to believe it. They're our children, but they're not our children. They came from some other place, some other people, some other personalities, some other cultures, some other, I guess it's Gibran that says your children are not your children. They're the sons and daughters of life longing for itself. And adoption teaches you that. And
Yeah.
I think that was a hard lesson to learn at first, but had good teachers.
So you can't mold them.
You can't mold them. I mean, you can certainly want to teach them, you want to inspire them, you want to give them opportunities, but you can't mold them. They're, any of them, even the ones born to us, but you think you can.
I always feel like they mold us because
Absolutely,
we
they
have
do.
to change in regard to each individual child.
Right, absolutely. And I guess the other thing, the Irish have a proverb that says it's better to bend than to break.
Mm.
And I think that's a part of parenting also, that you do have to bend. You don't want to bend because you're right. I mean, that's thinking you're right. I guess that's the biggest mistake. I have the answer here. Maybe you might have part of it, but you don't have the answer. So bending without breaking, I think is pretty good.
And if you look back, are there some things, I mean, I'm talking about mistakes here, your top 10 mistakes. What things would you do differently looking back?
I think I would have more empathy for the children in the family when a new child came, and not expect them to just adjust. I mean, I tried to give them room, but I should have given them more room. I should have given them more opportunity to complain.
Yeah.
They complained, all right, but you know what I mean? They didn't have permission. They didn't have as much permission to complain as I should have given them. I think that was a mistake.
Wow, that's really important. Really important. Anything else?
Well, I think, and this is maybe a more difficult one, I think I should have been more aware of the fact that we were putting together children who'd come from abusive or potentially abusive situations. We didn't always know, of course, but abusive situations, who had been sexually exploited, that we were putting them in a home with other children. And we knew, it's more important than I think we realized. That we had to make real, we had not to bend on that one. That had to be an absolute. Oh, and that's
When you mean absolute, you wouldn't do it, or absolute?
Oh, no, I would do it. Absolute, that you can't waffle around safety rules.
Okay.
Because in a family, you don't do blatant things, but things kind of, and that's really important. And I was only minimally aware of that, and I wish I had been more.
Privacy and safety.
Right. Yeah.
What did you do? I mean, obviously raising 13 children is a handful, and probably all absorbing, but I'm looking at the beautiful wall behind you and I'm thinking, you've created for yourself a very loving environment. It's reflected in the image behind you. What kinds of things did you do outside of being an adoptive parent that sustained you, filled you, gave you joy?
Writing. I love to write. I'm not a big exerciser, but I walk. I've always walked every day, and I'm going to have a new knee here soon, so that because I can't stop walking.
Okay.
That to me is really important. It doesn't have to be any place wonderful. Just being outside is important to me.
Uh-huh.
Um, and being in some degree of privacy,
Uh-huh.
solitude, I guess. It's easy now, but it wasn't easy then. And also, of course, when Harvin was alive, having some time to ourselves.
Yes.
So
Did
I
you get
remember
a
one
chance
time
to get,
I'm sorry, go ahead.
oh, you go ahead. One time you what?
One time we were at some therapist and she said, well, you two just need to have once a week, you just need to go somewhere by yourselves and have a night out. And I thought, what are you going to send a platoon of Marines or what? How are we going to do this? Are you crazy? But so we couldn't always go out, but we did have a night that was ours, and the kids had something, hamburgers or something, and they left us alone, and they did leave us alone. And but more of that would have been helpful. I think, not that you can do it every day, but to have a routine that included time for yourself and your spouse, if you have a spouse or a partner, whatever.
Yeah.
So I think that.
Well, and if you're going to have children with high needs, making sure that you have a support system where somebody, a relative, a grandparent,
Right.
somebody literally can step into the fray
Right.
and give you that break.
Right.
I don't know that people prepare for that very well.
I don't think they do. No.
Yeah. Well,
And the reluctance, I think, to have other people take care of newly adopted kids. Rightly so. You don't want to, you want it to be close. You want them to know you're the parents, not just some other person who takes care of them. But you have to build that in to survive.
Yes, there's no question about that. I'm thinking about now you're a grandmother and maybe even a great grandmother.
Not a great grandmother, but a grandmother, yes.
Grandmother. Any wisdom about that? I mean, have your kids searched? Have they brought other people into the fold? How do they look today?
Well, it's interesting. I have always wanted my children to search. It's another one of those things where I think I can mold them, and they are not interested. I mean, it has always been from the time they first came. I was so supportive of them finding their first parents or their first families. So it's amazing to me that they don't. We do know some of their birth families. We know one of our sons who came from foster care. We don't know his mother. His mother's in care, mental health care, but his grandmother, we've met her and his aunt. But he's, he'll meet them, but he's not that interested. And so I don't know. Hey, it's interesting. I wish they had more. I would love to, but it's not my story, obviously.
Oh,
But
important statement. Yeah.
Yeah, they may yet. I don't know, but so far, no.
Anything about being a grandmother? I mean, you've got children by birth and children who come home through adoption.
Right.
Any differences that you experience?
Well, I do think that adoption trauma goes across generations, and that's something you probably know more. But I can see some of that, and that makes me sad, I'll have to say. You can, as a parent, you can give a child a home and a family, and they are fine, but their children have some of that trauma.
Isn't that interesting?
Yeah. I mean, not to the same degree, not, they're okay, but it's there. It's there. But one nice thing is that the cousins love each other. That's one thing that I really, they are a great troop and they get along well. They love to, be together and fool around. So that's a real pleasure.
That's lovely. One of the things I know is that my oldest, who was born to me, certainly was left with some of her own trauma and her own perspective on our family growth. Have the children born to you talked a bit about that over time?
They used to. They did. They did. You know, when they were teenagers, they were not exactly pro-adoption, but and they talked about it. We talked about it. They wrote some about it in the newsletter when we had that. So they have talked about that. But a few years ago, a good friend of mine, he calls his kids call me grandma, but he's not really, you know, adopted. But and he has parents, but his he and his wife decided to adopt kids. They had 3 kids born to them, and they decided to adopt. And the children born to them were not thrilled with the idea. And one of my daughters, who was born to me, took them aside and said, you know, I know it's hard. It will seem hard to you. She said, but look at our family now. Look at all we've gained from it. I thought, oh my God.
Good. So over time, there was some
Over
clarity.
time. Yeah. Yeah.
So gotta hang in there.
Right.
So when people look back on your life, you know, when you're not here anymore, what would you like people to say about you?
I guess that I tried to connect with people. You know, I think Emerson's poem, I don't know what it's called, but about yourself, that and I can't quote it directly, but if one person's life has been made better by your life, then you've been successful.
Mhm.
So that's, you know.
Well, you'll be elevated pretty up high there because you've done a lot of good work for a lot of people.
Don't forget about all those mistakes.
Yes, yes. Well, on these final thoughts, are there some other words of wisdom for families who are struggling right now, who are really not liking their children very much at the moment and are really struggling in their adoptive parenthood? What would you say to them?
Well, I think listening, it's easy to say, listen, you know, because when your kids are acting out, you don't feel like listening to them. And what they're saying is not very nice anyway. But trying to listen, that's another advantage of having a support group, is that you can hear it from other people's kids more than you can hear it from yourself. And just listening to their lives and trying to step back for a minute and try not to take things personally. It's pretty personal when they're coming at you with the knife or something, but it's not personal really. But it feels so personal that it's hard to have that distance. But I really think that support groups, you know, I'm tooting my own horn here, but support groups saved our family, I think, you know.
Ours too, I would agree.
Yeah.
Absolutely. The piece that you shared on not taking it all personally, you know, recognizing that our children they have a lot of mothers in their head and a lot of fathers in their head and so on. So when they get angry or they lie or they steal or whatever it is they do that upsets our apple carts, if we can remember that that's their way of talking. Did you feel like that eventually became true for you, that these were ways of telling you something?
Yes, but it's again, that's why I think that's easier to understand from somebody else, from somebody else's child. You know, behavior is language, right? I mean,
Yeah.
it means something. It's not just at you, you know.
Right.
One of our kids, one of our kids had this habit, among others, of turning off the main, you know, where all the fuses are, the fuse box, turning it off. And poor Harvin put a lock on it, and he could pick that. That was no problem. Put a little box around. I mean, and it just became a challenge, you know. So, and one day we were here, and we were working on the book that Fair put out, and so there was, you know, 5 or 6 of us working on the book, and it was evening. It was just, it was winter, so it was getting dark about 5 o'clock, and the lights went out, and I thought, oh God. So I went out there and I got her, and he turned them off. So I brought him in the house, and he went up the stairs, and there's a landing on our stairs. It goes up, and then there's a landing. So he was sitting at the top there, and I said, Chris, why do you do that? I guess I'd never asked him before. And he said, I want you to know what it's like to be in the dark.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Oh,
I just, all I thought, I mean, he did it for years, that he was just doing it to us,
yeah.
It's like, wow.
Mm. Did you ever give up on any of your children?
I felt like it sometimes. I guess Harvin and I never gave up at the same time.
Wow, that's important to know.
Yeah. Yeah. So, if we could take a walk or take a ride, maybe something to get away for a while. And then, no, I never really gave up. I never gave up on him, and nor did he, but we came close individually, but not, uh,
I can't thank you enough. I hope that when people watch this, they're going to feel hopeful and inspired, and also understand the elements that allowed you to end up with this big, glorious family and grandchildren who care about each other, and grandchildren who come together as a clan.
yeah,
I mean, and maybe the grandchildren who aren't carrying the trauma become healers yet again in another generation for the children who do carry trauma.
right. Yeah, I hope so. Yeah. Uh, Years before adoption, before long, long ago, I was in the Peace Corps, and there was a saying that the Sergeant Shriver, I guess, said that the Peace Corps was the worst job you'd ever love, which was true of the Peace Corps, but it's also true about adoption. It is the worst job that you'll ever love. So,
Thank you, Nancy.
oh, thank you.
Oh, wonderful to see you. And I hold you in such high regard. This was very precious time for me.
Oh, thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
You take care.
You too.